My son's school made a mistake when they decided to target him, thinking I was just a busy father on the other side of the world. What they didn't know was that for Leo, I'd walk away from a 9-figure deal and bring their entire institution to its knees. The call came when I was in a boardroom in Tokyo, overlooking the Imperial Palace Gardens, about to close a 9-figure deal. The screen on my phone lit up with a name I'd programmed to bypass any Do Not Disturb setting. Leo's School. My heart, which had been steady and calm moments before, gave a hard, painful thud against my ribs. I excused myself immediately, ignoring the surprised looks from the Japanese executives. You don't walk out of a meeting like this. Ever. But my son, Leo, is the one rule I will break all others for. This is Marcus Thorne, I said, my voice tight as I stepped into the hallway. Mr. Thorne, this is Principal Evans at Northgate Preparatory. His voice was reedy and administrative, the kind that's practiced at sounding concerned without actually feeling anything. I'm calling about Leo. There's been another incident. Ice flooded my veins. Another? What happened? Is he okay? He's physically unharmed, Mr. Thorne, but his teacher, Mrs. Davison, found him drawing in his notebook again during her lecture. When she confiscated it, he became quite sullen and uncooperative. She feels his behavior is becoming a persistent disruption. I took a deep, steadying breath, the view of Tokyo's skyline blurring in my periphery. Drawing. My 10-year-old son, a boy who processes the world through his pencil, was being a persistent disruption for drawing. This was the third call like this in 2 months. Mr. Evans, I said, keeping my voice level with extreme effort. Leo is the quietest kid in his class. He's an A student. His disruption is sketching in the margins of his notebook. Is he talking? Is he throwing things? Is he bothering other students? Well, no, but Mrs. Davison doesn't like it, I finished for him. Has she tried talking to him about why he draws? Has she tried to understand that it helps him focus? I sent you the articles from his child psychologist explaining this. Yes, we have that on file. But Mrs. Davison has been teaching for 30 years, Mr. Thorne. She has a system, and she feels Leo is showing a lack of respect for her authority. I knew what this was about. I knew it from the first parent-teacher conference when Mrs. Davison had looked at me, a black man in a tailored suit, with a flicker of surprise and then a thin, condescending smile. She talked down to me, explaining the basics of the school's homework policy, as if I were incapable of understanding it. She'd mentioned the importance of a stable home life, with a pointed look that made my blood boil. She didn't know that I was a widower, that Leo's mother had passed when he was 5, and that providing that stability was the very reason I worked myself to the bone. All she saw was a black father, and she had already written the script for who we were. After the call with the principal, I hung up and immediately dialed Leo. He picked up on the second ring, his voice small. Hi, Dad. Hey, buddy. You okay? A sniffle. Yeah. He wasn't. Leo, talk to me. What really happened with Mrs. Davison? There was a long pause, and I could picture him perfectly, curled up in his room, his sketchbook clutched in his hands. She took my drawing, he whispered. I was just sketching a dragon from the history lesson. She said it was a waste of time, and that people like me need to focus on what's important if we ever want to get anywhere. The world tilted. People like you? What did she mean by that, Leo? His voice cracked. I don't know. The way she said it was mean. She ripped it up, Dad. She ripped the dragon in half right in front of everyone. Something inside me, a carefully controlled dam of professional calm, began to splinter. This wasn't about a system or respect anymore. This was a teacher with a vendetta against a 10-year-old boy. I had chosen Northgate Prep because it was supposed to be the best. I paid a small fortune in tuition to ensure my son would be nurtured, challenged, and above all, safe. And instead, I had delivered him to a bully. I'm sorry, buddy. I'm so sorry. That was not okay of her to do. My mind was racing, time zones and flight schedules swirling in my head. She hates me, Dad. The words were a gut punch, delivered with the devastating certainty only a child can possess. She always picks me. She asks me questions she knows I don't know, and when I do know the answer, she says I wasn't paying attention. Nothing I do is ever right. I closed my eyes. the rage a cold, hard knot in my chest. I had tried to handle this the right way. I'd sent polite emails. I'd had phone conferences. I had offered to fly in for a meeting, but they were always booked. The school had chosen its side. They were protecting their veteran teacher over my child. They'd made their decision. Now, I would make mine. "Leo," I said, my voice changing, gaining a firmness that he knew meant business. "Listen to me. You're not to worry about this for one more second. Do you understand? I'm going to handle Mrs. Davison. I'm going to handle the principal. I'm on my way." "But you're in Japan," he said, his voice filled with a heartbreaking mix of hope and confusion. "That's like a whole day away." I looked out the window at the setting sun, painting the Tokyo sky in hues of orange and purple. Below, on a private airfield, my Gulfstream G650 sat waiting. The 9-figure deal, the executives in the boardroom, the entire reason I was on this side of the planet, it all vanished. It was just noise. The only thing that mattered was the small, broken voice of my son on the other end of the line. "It's not as far as you think, buddy," I said, a dangerous calm settling over me. "I'll be there tomorrow morning. Just get through the rest of the day. I promise you, things are going to be very different at school tomorrow." I hung up, strode back to the boardroom door, and pushed it open without knocking. The room fell silent. I looked the lead executive in the eye and said, "Gentlemen, something more important has come up. We're done for today." Then I turned to my assistant. "Get the pilot ready. We're leaving in 1 hour. File a flight plan for Northgate Regional Airport, and get me Principal Evans on the phone. I want a meeting with him and Mrs. Davison. Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. sharp. Tell him I'm coming in person to discuss my son's future at his institution." The flight across the international dateline was a blur of satellite calls, data streams, and cold, simmering fury. I didn't sleep. I sat in the cream leather seat of the cabin, the quiet hum of the Gulfstream's engines the only sound, and I prepared for war. My team in New York had been up all night, digging. They compiled a comprehensive file not just on Mrs. Davison, but on Principal Evans, on Northgate Preparatory's Board of Trustees, their endowment, their donor list, and every discrimination complaint that had ever been whispered against them. I read it all. I absorbed it. Knowledge wasn't just power. It was ammunition. And I was going into this meeting armed to the teeth. We touched down at a small regional airfield just after sunrise. The air was crisp and cool, a world away from the humidity of Tokyo. A black sedan was waiting on the tarmac. Door open. I didn't have luggage, just my briefcase. As we drove through the quiet, tree-lined streets towards the school, the sheer absurdity of the situation struck me. I'd crossed 9 time zones, left a fortune on the table, all to confront a 10-year-old's teacher. But it wasn't just any teacher. It was a person who was trying to dim my son's light, to make him feel small, to poison his spirit. And for that, I would cross the entire globe without a second thought. Northgate Preparatory was exactly as advertised. Old brick, covered in ivy, with a manicured lawn that looked like it was cut with scissors. It screamed old money and tradition. It was a place designed to make people feel like they didn't belong unless they were born into it. I walked through the heavy oak doors and the entire reception area seemed to fall silent. The receptionist, a woman with perfectly coiffed gray hair, looked up from her computer, her eyes widening slightly as she took in my suit, my height, my presence. I was not the parent she was expecting. "I'm Marcus Thorne," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the hushed hall. "I have a 10 o'clock meeting with Principal Evans and Mrs. Davison." Of course, Mr. Thorne," she stammered, fumbling with her phone. "They're expecting you. Right this way." Principal Evans's office was filled with dark wood, leather-bound books he'd probably never read, and photos of him shaking hands with minor local politicians. He stood up a little too quickly when I entered, his hand outstretched, a practiced, placating smile on his face. "Mr. Thorne, thank you for coming in. I know it's terribly short notice. We just want what's best for Leo." I ignored his hand. I walked past him and stood in front of the large window overlooking the school's football field. "What's best for Leo," I said, turning to face him, "is an environment where he isn't targeted, belittled, and emotionally abused by his teacher. Evans's smile faltered. Now, Mr. Thorne, I think abused is a very strong word. Mrs. Davison is a veteran educator. The door opened before he could finish, and in walked a woman who looked like she was carved from chalk. She was thin, severe, with a tight perm and a cardigan pulled around her shoulders like armor. Her eyes, small and sharp, scanned me from head to toe before a tight, condescending smile formed on her lips. This was Mrs. Davison. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice like cracking ice, "I'm so glad you could make time for us. It's important for parents to be involved." The patronizing tone was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. She was expecting to run the show. She was expecting a parent she could intimidate, a father she had already stereotyped and dismissed. She thought this was her room, her rules. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting them both squirm. Then I walked to the polished mahogany table, placed my briefcase on it, and clicked open the latches. Evans and Davison exchanged a nervous glance. I didn't pull out a folder of legal documents. Not yet. I reached in and pulled out a single, clear plastic sleeve. Inside it were the torn pieces of a drawing, carefully taped back together. It was Leo's dragon. I slid it across the table so it stopped directly in front of Mrs. Davison. Her eyes flickered down to it, and for the first time a hint of genuine surprise crossed her face. "This," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "is what you called a persistent disruption. This is the drawing of a dragon from a history lesson that my son was creating. You ripped it in half. You ripped it in half in front of his classmates, and then you told him, and I have his exact words here, that people like me need to focus on what's important if we ever want to get anywhere." I leaned forward slightly, pinning her with my gaze. The practiced composure on her face was starting to crack. Principal Evans looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. "So we're going to start there," I continued, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "Forget school policy. Forget your 30 years of experience. We are going to sit here, Mrs. Davison, and you are going to explain to me, in excruciating detail, exactly what you meant by people like me." Mrs. Davison flinched as if I had slapped her. The smug superiority drained from her face, replaced by a pasty, defensive pallor. She opened her mouth, then closed it, glancing at Principal Evans for support. He just fiddled with a pen on his desk, his eyes darting between us, a man desperately out of his depth. I simply meant students who are distracted," she finally stammered, her voice losing its icy edge. "Students who don't apply themselves. It had nothing to do with anything else." I gave a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, I think it had everything to do with anything else. Let's not be coy, Mrs. Davison. You've had a problem with my son since the day you met him. Let's review, shall we?" I reached into my briefcase again and pulled out a slim file folder. I didn't even need to open it. I had memorized its contents on the flight over. On September 14th, you accused Leo of cheating on a math quiz because his score was, and I quote from your email, "unexpectedly high." It was only after he took the quiz again in front of you with the same result that you grudgingly dropped the matter. On October 3rd, you gave him detention for insolence when he corrected you on a historical fact about the Benin Empire, a fact he knew because his mother was a historian who specialized in West African history. You told him not to be a know-it-all. On October 25th, during a class presentation, you repeatedly interrupted him, asking him to speak more clearly, even though every other student and parent in the room could understand him perfectly. With each point, her face tightened. Principal Evans sank lower in his chair, the color draining from his face. He was realizing this was not a simple meeting with an irate parent. This was a deposition. "This isn't about drawing in a notebook, and it's not about a lack of respect," I said, my voice low and steady. "This is a pattern. It's a pattern of you singling out my son, a pattern of you attempting to undermine his confidence, question his intelligence, and make him feel like an outsider in your classroom. And you have the audacity to tear up his artwork and deliver a thinly veiled racist insult, assuming I would just take your word for it over the phone from halfway around the world. Now that is a very serious accusation, Mr. Thorne," Evans cut in, finally finding his voice, though it was weak and shaky. "Mrs. Davison is a respected member of our staff. Is she? I cut him off, turning my full attention to him. Is she more respected than your school's reputation? More respected than your endowment? I tapped the briefcase. Because in here, I have a file compiled by the best opposition research team money can buy. It contains details on 2 prior complaints filed against Mrs. Davison at her previous school for remarkably similar behavior complaints that were quietly settled and sealed. I have a list of every minority student who has mysteriously transferred out of her class over the past 5 years. I have financial statements showing this school's precarious dependency on a handful of key donors who, I can assure you, would be horrified to learn that Northgate Preparatory harbors and protects a teacher who bullies a 10-year-old black child. The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, marking the seconds of their careers that were flashing before their eyes. Mrs. Davison stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. The mask was gone. All that was left was the raw, ugly prejudice of a woman who had been confronted with a reality she never expected. She thought she was dealing with a stereotype. Instead, she was dealing with me. What do you want?" Evans finally whispered, the pretense completely stripped away. "What do I want?" I stood up, my shadow falling over the mahogany table. "I want 2 things. First, Mrs. Davison's immediate and unconditional resignation. I don't want her suspended. I don't want her moved to another class. I want her gone from this school by the end of the day. She will not be in the same building as my son ever again." I paused, letting the finality of that demand sink in. Then I turned my gaze back to the teacher. "Second," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, precise whisper. "I want you, Mrs. Davison, to walk into your classroom, right now, with me and Principal Evans. You will stand in front of your students, and you will give my son, Leo Thorne, a public and sincere apology. You will apologize for destroying his property. You will apologize for trying to humiliate him. And you will tell the entire class that you were wrong. You will do this so that every child in that room understands that the kind of behavior you have displayed is unacceptable, weak, and will not be tolerated." Evans looked horrified. "A public apology? In front of the children? Mr. Thorne, that's unprecedented. It would undermine her authority completely." "Her authority?" I shot back, my voice laced with disbelief. "She has no authority. She forfeited it the moment she decided her classroom was a place for her to exercise her personal bigotries. She can resign with a shred of dignity after making amends to the child she wronged, or she can be fired in disgrace when this story and all the supporting evidence in my briefcase hits the national news by lunchtime. Your choice." I looked at my watch. "I suggest you decide quickly. My pilot is waiting." Mrs. Davison just sat there, frozen, staring at the torn dragon on the table. The silence stretched, thick with tension. It was the moment of truth. Would they call my bluff? Would they try to fight? Evans licked his lips, looking from me to Davison, his administrative mind calculating the cost of a scandal versus the cost of a single teacher's pride. Finally, with a deep, shuddering sigh of defeat, he nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Thorne, we'll do it." He looked at Davison, his expression grim. "Helen, let's go." As we walked down the hushed hallway towards Leo's classroom, I felt a grim satisfaction. But it wasn't over. Not yet. We stopped outside the door, and I could hear the low murmur of children inside. Evans took a deep breath, his hand on the doorknob. But before he could turn it, I put a hand on his arm, stopping him. He looked at me, confused. "There's one more thing," I said, my voice barely audible. "Something you should know before we go in there. You seem to think I'm just some wealthy, angry father. You're mistaken." I paused, letting him lean in slightly. "My late wife, Dr. Alana Thorne, Leo's mother. Before she passed, she sat on the board of the National Education Fund, the very same fund that granted Northgate $10 million 2 years ago to build your new science wing." I watched the last bit of color drain from his face as the realization dawned. "I took her seat on the board after she died, and our next grant review meeting is on Friday." Principal Evans looked like he had been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The $10 million grant wasn't just a line item on his budget. It was the crown jewel of his tenure, the thing he bragged about to alumni and prospective parents. The idea that its future was in the hands of the man he had been dismissing for months was a blow he couldn't possibly have anticipated. The sweat on his brow was no longer just from stress. It was from the sheer, abject terror of a man watching his entire professional world crumble. He didn't say a word. He simply pushed the classroom door open and stumbled inside, with Mrs. Davison shuffling behind him like a condemned prisoner. I followed, my expression unreadable. The classroom fell silent instantly. 30 pairs of young eyes turned towards us, wide with curiosity and confusion. I scanned the room and found him immediately. Leo. He was sitting in the third row, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes were on his desk, and he was trying to make himself invisible. When he saw me, his eyes widened in shock, a flicker of hope warring with fear. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm here. I've got this." Mrs. Davison walked to the front of the class, her face a blotchy, miserable mess. She looked out at the students, her usual air of stern authority completely gone. She looked old, frail, and utterly defeated. "Class," Principal Evans began, his voice strained and cracking. "Mrs. Davison has something she needs to say to Leo." All eyes shifted to my son, who shrank even further in his seat. This was the hardest part. I hadn't wanted to put him on the spot, but this wasn't just about punishment. It was about restoration. It was about publicly righting a public wrong. Mrs. Davison swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the floor in front of Leo's desk. "Leo," she began, her voice a reedy whisper. I want to apologize." She finally lifted her head, and her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. Whether they were tears of remorse or humiliation, I didn't care. "What I did yesterday was wrong. I should not have taken your drawing, and I certainly should not have torn it up." She took a shaky breath. "It was a beautiful dragon. You are a very talented artist, and what I said to you was unfair and untrue. I am sorry. I was wrong to try and humiliate you in front of your friends." A ripple went through the classroom. The children were looking at each other, their expressions a mix of awe and shock. They had never seen a teacher apologize to a student before, not like this. I saw Leo slowly sit up a little straighter, his chin lifted off his chest. "Your resignation is accepted, Mrs. Davison," Principal Evans said quietly into the silence. "You can collect your personal belongings after school." He then turned to the class. "Students, Mrs. Davison will no longer be your teacher. We will have a substitute starting this afternoon." The finality of it hung in the air. Mrs. Davison gave one last broken look at the class she had ruled for years, and then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the room. I watched her go, feeling not triumph, but a grim sense of necessity. Her career was over, but my son's spirit was beginning to heal. As Principal Evans stammered through an awkward transition, I walked over to Leo's desk. I knelt beside him, ignoring the stares of the other children. "You okay, buddy?" I asked softly. He looked at me, and his eyes were shining. He didn't say anything. He just threw his arms around my neck and hugged me with all the strength his 10-year-old body possessed. I held him tight, feeling the tension drain out of his small frame. In that moment, the lost deal in Tokyo, the cost of the jet fuel, the sheer chaos of the last 24 hours, it all melted away into complete and utter insignificance. Later, in the car on the way home, Leo was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the passing trees. I had already called the school and officially withdrawn him. He wouldn't be going back to Northgate. We would find a new school, a better one, a place where his creativity would be seen as a gift, not a disruption. "Dad," he finally said. "Yeah, buddy?" "That was the coolest thing I've ever seen." I smiled. "Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, Leo, no matter how old they are." "She really ripped up my dragon," he said, a hint of the old sadness in his voice. I reached into the passenger seat and picked up my briefcase. I opened it and took out the plastic sleeve containing the carefully taped-together drawing. I handed it to him. He took it, his fingers tracing the taped lines where the rip had been. "It's not perfect anymore," he said quietly. "No," I agreed. "It's not. But now it has a better story. It's the dragon that crossed the ocean and won a battle. It's got scars. Scars aren't a sign of weakness, Leo. They're a sign of strength. They mean you were hurt, but you survived." He looked from the drawing to me, a real, genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time in what felt like months. He held the dragon up to the window, letting the sunlight shine through it. In that moment, I knew he was going to be okay. We were going to be okay. I had left a boardroom to come fight for my son, and in doing so, I had closed the most important deal of my life.